So hello and welcome to this revision video on Germany and the Great Depression. In this lesson we're going to focus on the impact of the Depression and how that affected everyday life for people in Germany. We're going to look at the growth of support for the Nazis and of course other extremist groups such as the Communist Party, for example. We're going to talk about the role of the SA and also Hitler's appeal, and just generally look at the reasons why the Nazis increased their support in Germany in the early 1930s. So let's find out more about this topic. Off we go. Okay, so the Great Depression hit Germany in the early 1930s after the 1929 Wall Street crash. And as we've seen, this came after the era of the golden age of the Weimar Republic. And of course, in October 1929, both the death of Gustav Stresemann and the Wall Street crash put Germany into another economic crisis. And it's important to understand this in the context that Germany had already gone through the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, and here we have now, in the early 1930s, another economic crisis. So in terms of the question of the impact of the Great Depression, well, in the 1928 German election, the Nazis got just 3% of the vote, and that's a statistic that's really worth remembering. They only got 12 seats in the Reichstag. So it seemed like in 1928 that the Nazi Party were over as a political force in Germany. In that election, 61% of those elected supported the Weimar Republic, with the Chancellor at the time, Hermann Müller, leading what was known as the Grand Coalition. The economy had recovered to 1913 levels, and between 1925 and 1929, German exports had rose 40%. However, the impact of the Wall Street crash in October 1929, when the shares on the American stock market collapsed, caused huge problems in Germany. America gave Germany 90 days, just 90 days to repay the loans, and as a result, the German economy collapsed. It led to huge economic problems, 6 million people unemployed. There was a banking crisis in the summer of 1931 where 5 banks went bust. So you can imagine how people lost their savings, and many people, as a result, turned to extreme political parties with the Nazis and the Communists. And you can see there a very famous Nazi election poster from the 1930s, which promised work and bread for the German people. So it's important to think about the impact of the Great Depression. People lost faith in the Weimar Republic and their ability to run the economy. Businesses closed down, demand for goods fell dramatically. 50,000 German businesses closed between 1929 and 1932. Food prices rose dramatically. Farmers were making less profit. There was about 18,000 farmers that had gone bankrupt by 1932. Unemployment is one of the major features of the Great Depression in Germany. The statistic is that there were about 6 million registered unemployed in 1932, but the true figure could have been even higher. And when you think about the impact on people, that if somebody lost their job, that might affect a person's whole family. And looking at almost 17 million people that were affected by unemployment within Germany during this time. There's begging on the streets. There's people begin living in the forests outside Berlin, for example. And of course, those that remained in work saw the value of their wages decrease. So in 1932, the value of workers' wages was down by about 1/3. The Weimar Republic had a comprehensive welfare system, but this collapsed. The government didn't have the money, so they had to reduce government wages and they had to increase taxes by around 60%. So you had a huge economic storm. Within this time period, crime and disorder grew. The streets became increasingly lawless. Unemployment particularly affected young people. Many of those young people joined gangs. There's more violence on the streets. And ultimately, the Great Depression had a huge political impact in that political parties, such as the Nazis, capitalized on these problems, offering solutions such as the brown shirts, the SA, being able to restore order on the streets, slogans such as "Our Last Hope" and "Work and Bread." So one of the big questions to think about is what factors led to increased support for the Nazi Party. So firstly, the starting point is to think about what did this actual support look like. So you can see there in the bottom right hand corner, it tells you what percentage of votes the Nazis were getting between 1928 and 1933, and crucially how many seats that they were winning in the Reichstag. And you can see that the seats rose from 12 in May 1928 to 107 in September 1930, and in July 1932, 230 seats. A statistic that's really worth bearing in mind is that in November 1932, the Nazis got 196 seats, and they actually lost 2 million votes between the July and November 1932 elections. So that's a statistic that's worth bearing in mind, that just before Hitler was appointed Chancellor, the Nazi support was actually decreasing. Now, in the March 1933 election, the Nazis got a considerable amount more support, but historians wouldn't particularly regard that as a fair election, because the Nazis had taken control, and the SA, for example, the brown shirts, were intimidating people into voting for the Nazis during that time. So the key factors for what led to increased support for the Nazis are Hitler's leadership skills and his character, the appeal of Nazi policies such as work and bread, the role of the SA, propaganda, fear of communism, and of course the impact of the Great Depression. So the first factor to think about when you're looking at the key question about what factors led to increased support for the Nazi Party were the appeal of Nazi policies. Now you can see there that Hitler set out his policies in his book Mein Kampf, and you can read those ideas, the idea of one strong leader, the Aryans and the master race, all Germans should be united in one country, all German-speaking people, communism must be destroyed, and the army must be rebuilt. So the Nazis' core support would be among right-wing nationalists. These sort of ideas hadn't particularly gone away in Germany. Many people believed in ideas such as the stab in the back myth, the idea of the November criminals, the idea that Germany wasn't properly defeated in the First World War. And even before the Great Depression, a media tycoon, Alfred Hugenberg, had run a nationalist campaign against the Young Plan of 1929. So there were these nationalist forces within Germany, and the Nazis were able to appeal to that. But kind of more broadly than that, the Nazis were able to use their messages of things like work and bread to appeal to a much larger group of people than many other political parties in Germany had done before. And this really helped the Nazis to win quite a wide range of support in the early 1930s. And ultimately, by July 1932, in that election when they got 230 seats, become the largest political party in Germany. Hitler's leadership skills were an important factor. He was seen as a strong leader. There was a sense in Germany in the 1930s that democracy had failed and that Germany needed a strong leader. And remember, of course, there was that tradition of Germany being led by one strong leader. And we'd seen that within the rule of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who of course ruled Germany between 1888 and 1918. There was a lot of propaganda that was invested within Hitler personally. Every year since 1924, the Nazis had held their party rallies at Nuremberg. Hitler's speeches, Hitler in the 1920s had practiced his speeches, and in fact leading Nazis had been trained in public speaking. So Hitler's speeches were often described in contemporary sources as being very powerful, being almost like a religious experience for some, could convert people to Nazi ideas, and giving his audience a sense of hope and putting across an impression of himself as a strong and powerful leader, always dressed in military uniform. So much of the reasons for the support of the Nazis were invested in the leadership of Hitler himself. In 1932, he stood to be president, and that helped boost his profile within Germany at the time, made him more famous, and certainly helped them to win more votes in the July 1932 election. And the Nazis did things such as Hitler, when he was campaigning, would travel around in a plane so that he would actually meet people personally, and this all added to some of the reasons why the Nazis won more support. The role of the SA was also crucial. The SA, the brown shirts, they were Hitler's private army. Many had been unemployed and had fought in the First World War. The SA had been set up in 1921, and they were influential, particularly in the early 1930s, because they would disrupt meetings of other political parties. They also protected Nazi members. They delivered propaganda. Some people were put off by their violence, but there was a sense, particularly among right-wing groups, that the SA would be able to bring order to the streets of Germany in a time of chaos. Remember, the impact of the Great Depression had led to an increase in crime, increase in gangs on the streets and that kind of thing. And there was, I suppose, a sense that the SA would be able to win the battle for the streets. There was also a sense that the SA could protect Germany from communism. And as you can see here from this quote from Hitler, we must struggle with ideas, but if necessary, also with fists. So the SA were very much part of this more violent struggle in Germany in the 1930s. Propaganda was crucial, and again, much of the foundations of the Nazi Party were laid in the 1920s. The Nazis trained their members in public speaking and propaganda in the 1920s. They were able to raise money for election campaigns from rich industrialists like people like Fritz Thyssen, media tycoons like Alfred Hugenberg. And I think one of the crucial things with Nazi policies and their propaganda was their policies appealed to everybody from businessmen to farmers to factory workers. They were able to understand how to get a message across. So you can see this poster is a very, very famous one. It's called Our Last Hope. Showing the people that have been affected by the Great Depression, the slogan of work and bread, for example. The Nazis would do things like organise soup kitchens for the poor. And we already talked about the rallies that were really, really crucial as well, that were based in Nuremberg, with Hitler making his dramatic entrances and his speeches, propaganda. Sometimes there could be up to 100,000 people in attendance at those. So the propaganda was really, really important, a range of different election posters and techniques that they used. And of course, propaganda would continue to be important when the Nazis came to power and were actually controlling people in Nazi Germany. So we look at some of these propaganda posters, you can see there's a range of different ideas, very sort of visual. The powerful images of the swastika, for example, that was immediately recognisable in Germany at the time as the symbol for the Nazis. Don't forget that the Nazis had raised their profile even in 1923 after the Munich Putsch, when Hitler had used his trial in 1924 to attack the Weimar Republic and put forward his policies and views. This poster on the far left-hand side, which you can see is just a black and white image of Hitler and just his head and his name. This was actually put up in election campaigns when there was lots and lots of different posters around, and this one was chosen to be a sort of stark contrast to the sort of vivid and bright colours of all the other election posters of different political parties. So they really understood how to get their message across. Fear of communism is another key factor for increased support for the Nazi Party. So there's some people that didn't particularly like the Nazis and didn't always approve of all of their policies and ways and methods, such as the SA, for example. But there was a real fear of communism in Germany amongst the sort of more wealthier groups. And there's a picture there of Ernst Thälmann, who was the leader of the German Communist Party, known as the KPD. And you can see that, for example, we've already talked about Alfred Hugenberg, and he launched his campaign against the Young Plan, and Hitler was very much involved in that. He was brought into that campaign, and that gave Hitler huge media attention. And I think really the key factor of fear of communism is that it makes some of the wealthier groups and the more traditional conservative groups, even some things like the German Nationalist Party, for example, but it also gives the Nazis money. So rich industrialists like Fritz Thyssen, for example, but there's plenty of others as well, they give money to the Nazis, and that's crucial because when the Nazis are given this money and funding, they're able to use that to fund their propaganda, for example, fund the plane journeys that are taking Hitler around Germany to meet people, and there was a sense amongst these industrialists and rich business people and these sort of right-wing forces in Germany, these conservative forces, that they would be able to control Hitler if he became leader. The SA as well, within what they were doing in the streets and their sort of violent attacks, they were seen by some people as standing up to communism. So the SA, for example, would go along to communist meetings, they would disguise themselves, and then during the meeting they would sort of reveal themselves, and basically they would break up the meeting. They would would beat people up. It would be pretty nasty events, to be honest. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and that's given you some food for thought in terms of the impact of the Great Depression in Germany, and crucially how the Great Depression was able to almost spark off the rise in the electoral support for the Nazi Party in the early 1930s and balance that against other factors. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.